Hello everyone, good afternoon and most welcome to lecture 717. There's a very nice afternoon here, no wind, and it's already getting dark, although it's not much past 3. This is the grim season of November, December. And in about 3 weeks' time it will not get any darker. So we are reaching the darkest point of the year. And this year I will remember it's the 23rd, or was it the 22nd? I don't remember. But it's, let's see here, it's 3 weeks. It's even less than that, almost 2 weeks only. So do remember that if you feel down. It's getting lighter soon. And speaking of lightening up or progressive development, I will today talk about 3 levels of adaptation or adoption, you can call it, to adopt a certain level. And to cut it extremely short for once, this subject is about T2 going to T1 and N2 going to N1. And it's the quick twitch muscles and the quick twitch neurons. The flight and fight mechanism in both these cases, the ones who take sugar as a nutrient and who are anaerobic. And going to the more proper muscle, the original muscle that we should have had, and which is in normal proportion among all animals, which is called T1 and N1. And these consume fat, and they do take oxygen in the consumption. And they don't give tiredness either. And the big difference also is that T1 is incredibly more stable, precise. It would hold the body for hours. I can stand, with T1 I can stand like this for a whole day without moving. It will be uncomfortable in the end, but it won't take any perceivable energy for my part. When it comes to N1, the neurons one, we know now they are the seat of intelligence, because they are the ones that are used when there is no stress situation, when we plan, when we argue with ourselves or others, when we make discoveries, when we are creative. Whereas in N2, that's the part of the neurons that wants to escape. They are not well suited to thinking at all. Actually, they refrain from thinking. They want to run as quick as possible because that is their purpose. But N1 is the seat of intelligence. That's the thinking capacity, the one that can make a sensible decision and can also lead action in T1. So it will be perfected, whereas N2 will produce clumsy, discoordinated movements that are not well adapted to the environment. And this process takes somewhere in between 9 to 10 months, well initiated and well executed. The neurons will come after the muscles. The muscles is here named T. So we have 2 methods that goes in the same hand, and there are a little variety from the method we discussed earlier with Jan Eiskens. And this idea is taking the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere at the same time. The left hemispheres and its problems is better served with something that it needs, a task at hand. And that task should be verbal letters that make up words, make up sentences. And this could be a paragraph, it could be a cant, it could be a psalm, it could be a hymn. But it needs to be rather long, cannot be too short. And that one needs to be learned by heart. And this is going to slow down the agitated thinking process, which is L2. And that's actually the starting point. This is the most important. For without the left hemisphere and its chattering going on, it can be no stopping of thinking that will enable the other thing here, and that's the right hemisphere. And we're talking about something that's usually called ultrasonic movability or slow movement. And this is directed towards the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is the one with the motoric capacity. Therein you find proprioception, kinesthesia, and the bulk of all the other senses. And by slowing down, you will reopening the feedback system. So you could say it's a healing system that starts to kick in when you slow, at least for a while every day, down your regular movements. The body will discover unnecessary, uncalled for movements. It will also discover the discrepancy between the thoughts that are sent out to enforce the action and what the actual action is. Otherwise, the system is working too quick to be able to read off itself. Cannot do that because the system is in turmoil. T2 and N2 is actually literally turmoil. It's not a natural state to be in any longer than a couple of minutes, once every second week, something like that. I would say at most within a deer or a hare, it's a very, very little part of the day. And they always go back to T1, N1 after a short while, if they get scared or something else happens. Whereas as human beings, for every time we make the process even worse, we get even more agitated in our thinking or tensed in our muscular area, we will go back even less. So there is a development in the wrong direction. It starts by itself because these are constantly agitated. It's a permanent state that's extremely unnatural for any living being. So what will happen after a while in these recordings I studied is that after already a couple of weeks there will be a noticeable difference in body feel. It could be noted as a calming down of action. It could also be noted of less tension when you do something. The tension to hold something medium heavy becomes less, and the actual object is starting to feel lighter. And I already discovered this weird tendency that things that I used to think were very heavy now starting to feel rather light. And the reason, of course, is the better muscle. The better muscle are more able to withstand force. When the process continues in the development or the re-education of the psychophysical unit, it will be clearer that we're starting to achieve some sort of flow in the movements. Flow means there is not this regular stopping that is so very noticeable among modern people. They do something and they absolutely stop. They go into termination thinking. This action is ready, I shouldn't do anything more. And there is a rather brute stop. That could be likened to stopping a car when on the highway, when you're driving 110 to 0. And this is something that is not good either for the system. That makes for very shaky, uneven movements. And what will happen, maybe could even be shaking. If you manage to get it to a very low level, the M2 and the T2 will respond with shaking because they're not able to hold movement very, very slow. They're not built for that. And that shaking and that tremble is a good sign you reach the right level or speed. That will change. In the end, you will be able to perform any action without stopping in something that's called a seamless movement. And a seamless movement is that there is no obvious stops on the way. I don't force myself into action, because that is what we normally do. When we sit on a chair, we need to get up, we need to force ourselves up. We don't get up voluntarily, because this makes for a very heavy body. And by forcing yourself, you get this seam to be very obvious, because instead of a continuous movement, there is an absolute stop, and then I go into action. And when the action is done, I almost get exhausted in a little way. It puts a horrible force also on the spine, because the muscular groups in the body are contradictory. They contradict the direction I want to go in. They're not following lead. And that's typical for T2. And the forcible getting up can look like this, something that I really strain myself to get up. And the idea is already in my head, because this is also a timing thing. The idea is, before I get up, I know it's going to be hard. It's going to be some feel to it. And that's also part of the process. We need to relearn how heavy it is to move things, how heavy it is to move ourselves, how heavy it is to walk around. We need to get used to it. It can actually be much lighter than it used to be. And this lightness can actually be a bit scary in the beginning. It doesn't really feel that you're moving at all. So you need to be focused and understand movement still happens, even if it's not very strenuous. And this is also something I find in the literature called the balancing phase. It involves the head on the neck, and it will be much easier to balance the head on the neck once you're starting to get proprioception. You're starting to get the correct in-data. These don't get any sensible in-data at all, because that's not their job. Their job is to make you fly or flight as quick as humanly possible. But the balancing phase is, surprisingly enough, largely automatic. Once you get feedback from your body, the system itself will start readjusting, and in the readjusting process, direction starts to come up. You can actually sense the directions, and one of them goes up. and it's a very pure feel of direction upwards. And second to that would be directions that expands you. You can start feeling the directions, and these directions are actually the directions Friedrich Matthias Alexander mentions. They will become more obvious, and they become more and more obvious. There is a ascending scale where everything gets slowly easier, and then comes a movement when it catches on. And this is important because in that instance it could look, if you're going to make a very brute graph, it could look like this, and it goes off a tangent and it started to develop faster and faster. And the reason for that is you starting to learn consciously this is working. And once that happens, you get the ultimate proof, and then your intention is going to be much, much stronger. And intention is worth gold in these cases, because just having the wish and the intention goes much farther than putting brute force. So we're going to leave the heavy body away, and you will feel that intention itself can get your body out of its place. And this, of course, is the start of the combination of thinking and action, already showing certain signs that is going to happen. There is also a visual feedback, visual and proprioceptive, and because we are visual creatures, we are maybe too visual these modern days. Everything that is proven needs to be seen, and a lot of language, let's say even Swedish, even if you don't use the term, we see things, then we understand them, and to see something is to have it in your hand. But that's okay, because we have to start with what we have. And that's an interesting point. Once you see that your moves and legs are actually moving better, that will be a very strong feedback, because that's proof, that's money on the bank. And there is a possibility here that you will strain yourself. So be aware the process will do its own job. Don't get too greedy at this instance. And you can get too greedy when you begin to notice visually that there is an obvious change. And that could also come from the environment. Actually, they could be quicker to notice that. But I would say it should be ignored mostly. Well, to a certain extent, let that help your intention, but don't let it go overboard, because it will still be a direct synergetic effect. Once you get more feedback, more comes out of the system. We know with the T2 and N2 there is hardly any feedback at all, and that's why the whole system is in a loop. One side is doing too hard muscle work, and the other side is doing too much, what can you say, errated thinking that doesn't have a direction. Or another word is inact thinking that doesn't end in action. Empty thinking. And that's one of the reasons I would say that a lot of people these days, including myself, could actually feel that we are inside, our heads are inside a vat, or brains are somewhere else. And that's an obvious effect of these tendencies. You don't feel to be exactly in the world. And you almost have a feeling it can be doubted. If you're here, are you really here in this world? Well, the doubt is almost possible. And that's a very sure sign that the connection to the proprioceptive, the feeling, the perception, is very far away. Now comes another interesting point here, and we are both mind and body. So in this, this has to be the fourth phase. In this fourth phase, you start looking at what is non-dual understanding of the world, because you start realizing somewhere at a very, very profound level, in an implicit level, that you are a whole. And when you start doing that, you start thinking then the outer world must also be a whole. And I call that the intellectual phase. And as I mentioned before, N1 is usually slower to kick in the beginning. And when they start kicking in, they want to have more understanding of the world. It's like the thinking process has been in hibernation, like a bear has been in his winter dwelling and now comes out. What's happened now, and this is a lot of testimonies on the internet, when people start thinking, they can get completely confused. It's like they're growing a new skill all of a sudden. Raymond Dart mentioned this as the event of the intellect coming back into our life. And that's everything that has to do with planning, reasoning in a general way, analyzing, but also this very important, how to put thoughts into action. They become more and more the same thing. And this is similar to, I mentioned in a lecture 10 lectures ago, that things are actually sort of action that been cemented. A coffee cup is actually the action of drinking coffee, otherwise the coffee cup wouldn't be there. But in our regular talking, it's become an object with no use, something that you can look at a distance, like it's material or something, but you use it for something. And there is a specific movement. And when I do the movement, the idea of the coffee cup comes into the system. Our tools are connected to the whole system in a very precise way. We know how to use the words in the language because we actually do the things we're referring to. It's not a reference in blind. We're not inside the chaos or the ideas. We are actually doing all the objects we're mentioning. And we have, and this could actually stop in this fourth phase, and that's a trickery or a misnomer coming from the current educational system. And it's the idea that intelligence cannot be improved. And maybe that idea is not intentional from the part of the educational system. But everything in the educational system today is taught like it was static, unchanging, and firmly established with a foundation. And that in itself is the problem. To say that the world is firmly established, it's having a doubling of the world. That's duality in action, so to speak. And then, of course, then should the thinking activity also be completely static, never changing, never developing. So the whole system gives this impression, even if it's not intentional. It should not be intentional. I don't think it is, because we have way too much information today, research-wise, that the brain is constantly changing. And if we treat the body in a nice way, like being in T1 and N1, it will actually develop. But if we mistreat it by staying in T1 and N2, it will age much quicker. And this is one of the reasons proposes an author called Rose for the development of Alzheimer and dementia these days, because that is progressing. And we know this is burning brain cells very, very quick because of the metabolism T2 and 2 has. It takes sugar, and that's not the best method. Fat is the more resilient and safer way of doing it. And what is going to happen here? We notice something very different in our thinking. We only need to think something and then it happens. And this is very hard to explain, but I think the best way of trying it is going and have an Alexander class. But you will notice all of a sudden, and this will only last for a short while, but you just pop up a thinking in your head and then it's done. And this is called conscious control of the individual. You have lost conscious control of yourself. And when you regain it, it's like having this odd superpower that every wish you want, it's going to get fulfilled. It's like the Alexander teacher is a genie in a bottle and can grant whatever you want. By the way, I have to tell you the joke about the genie in the bottle that was discovered by a Norwegian and a Swede and a Danish. And the genie in the bottle said, I usually have 3 wishes, but because you are 3 people, you will only get 1 each. But you can wish for whatever you want. And first in line was the Swede. He said, I've been blind since birth, so what I would like most is to see the beautiful sky, the birds in the air, the green ground, and my lovely wife. And the genie snapped his fingers and whoops, he could see again. And then it was the turn of the Danish, and he said, I really want to hear again. I've never been able to hear people's voices, music, birds singing, just the wind moving. So I would like to hear again. And the genie said, that will be done. And he snapped his finger, and all of a sudden the Danish could hear again. And then the last ultimate wish was for the Norwegian. He was actually sitting in a wheelchair. And the genie asked him, so what do you want? And the Norwegian started thinking. And he thought and he thought, and he said in the end, well, what I really need more than anything else are new wheels to my wheelchair. And this goes to show that especially in this area, you don't know how much you can wish for. You start wishing for smaller things. And one of those smaller things is, I don't want to have that much tension. Because you start noticing you have a lot of tension. So you start directing your mind to tension. Don't do that. Let the tension be. Leave it. Because it's going to disappear in the end anyway. What you need to put your intention to is higher goals. Don't do like the Norwegian, opt for a wheelchair when you can have your whole sense back. And that actually is a stopping thing. And it looks a little bit like this. I start feeling too tense and I want to de-tense a part. And that tension is going to pop up somewhere else. The reason for tension is because we are not together. We are not a unity, mind and body. And as long as that happens, there's going to be tension, because there is also going to be flappy parts, not sufficiently active parts. And once you have a balance where you don't tense your knees and don't tense your ankles, your hips and all that, the tension will be gone anyway. You don't have to wish for it. Don't do as the Norwegian, wish for lack of tension. Aim higher. Aim for the sky, because what you can do is quite immense. And to settle for less tension is opting for the very smaller thing. You will get it anyway, so don't worry. And here in this phase, the latter part of the fourth phase, even going into the fifth, you will no longer have that feeling, and that's a general feeling, very hard to point out, but the feeling that you are not in the world is going to disappear. And all of a sudden this idea that you could be a brain in the vat, that I think Putnam said, is going to, it doesn't mean anything anymore, it doesn't make any sense. I think that could actually be the dividing part, because you see here, mind goes together. You need to progress even also on a thinking level. That's important. You can't keep your all thinking. The thinking needs to go in the same direction as the body. And that means opening up. And you need to open up your ideas of what is the world and what is your sort of connection to the world. Those are very important things. And we usually deem those intellectual or categorical or analyze things. And we say, no, I can have a healthy body, I don't need to change those things. That's not correct. There is a very, very deep connection between mind and body. We think through our body. Our body is actually our anchor in the world. And that idea that the intellect flies by itself, that idea is dead and done. It will never come back to any neurology or cognition science any time. That will never happen. It used to be the case, and the thing is, it's still within common sense that's the case. That you could have a body that's in pain or not working and you can still think to a high level. That's impossible, because they go exactly hand in hand, go to the same level. So a change in perception of the world will take place there, and should take place, and it should also be helped. And here is very, very good to look at the obstacles for understanding the totality of the world. And that will also help the process. We are here now somewhere, I'd say. So the process will go even higher, because you will notice once you take off, it's almost limitless where you can get. And then we are into the fifth phase, and in the fifth phase, this will actually be working by itself. The development will continue, but you will have to do actively less and less, because that activity is no longer needed. Intention is going to move your body from one place to another. And intention, it has always been. Intention moved your body when you were very young. Intention moves the bodies of all animals. And when you're back to that, you could say, even if the development is going to continue, you reached a stage of sufficient healment. You don't have to go actively any further, because after that your views on the world change sufficiently that you won't turn back and become what you once were. Mind and body have sufficient, I use the word sufficient, correspondence. They are no longer like Descartes, moving in parallel ways with 1,000,000 kilometers in behind them. Your thinking will be in the direction of the body being a whole thing, and you don't have all these ideas that's starting to fall away already here, that you have some sort of separation with your body or the world. And this is also called the lowering of the subject into the body. You start feeling your body again, and with feeling the body comes the joy from the body. because that's one of the most interesting parts. We, in this stage, are actually shut out from bodily joy. And it goes to show, of course, it goes hand in hand with the heaviness that we feel. And the lack of joy in movement is discoordination. There's no possibility to have joy or satisfaction when your body is not in correspondence to your mind. That's impossible. Body is the seat to feel joy. And the body has a lot of different joyous inclinations. They're all different, but they're very much stronger, and you can actually get surprised. Could I feel that much? Was that much depth to everything? And that feeling is actually a body healed. When you do feel joy in a very true way, it's no longer something up in the stratosphere and very much inclined to be not of this world. It's a true joy, it's a playfulness, and of course it's the intention coming back in full force. And that's one of the reasons that it's never hard to see if somebody is in good shape. You see that at distance. That person is moving completely different from a person that is laid down. And all the energy is dissipating outside. It's like an aura of energy. Frederick Matthias Alexander was often stopped when he was walking around in London, which he frequently did. And people asked him, "Man, what are you doing? Sir, might I ask you, what is your trickery?" And they had no idea who it was, but they know that something was really, really peculiar and very odd. And they wanted to partake of it. And it's a little bit like you have a lot of water in the desert and nobody has a drink. That person will become very popular. But in the case of Frederick Matthias Alexander, it's a long way to achieve the results he did. It will take time. It will also take a lot of intention, especially in the beginning, before it takes off by itself. So then you get into the second level of adaptation, is when it becomes absolutely necessary to bring this new found skill, thinking and action into new action. Because for a while you were doing things, very repetitive, easy things. We've been training here before, getting in and out of a chair, getting up the staircase and so forth. But now you need to start bringing that skill into peculiar actions. Actions you don't repeat that often. And when you have to think maybe out of a new thing, driving a car for instance, finding your way somewhere, then you will note it's so much harder to put it in again. Maybe it will disappear the moment that you lost in the ways. And that's a specific training, and it takes double thinking. And these are one of those things that Alexander pointed out. Almost everybody thought was completely impossible to have two thoughts processes going on in the same time. He proved it's not impossible. And actually you can have even more than two running at the same time. It's a little bit like you start one thought process to move, that will continue to move, and you put in the next thought process. And in the end you have several parallel going thought process. And I would say that it lies in the very kernel of the Alexander technique, to be able to do that. And actually to believe it's possible to do. Because the sheer idea it's impossible will stop you in your development. But it's not impossible. And I think Alexander proved that with all his might in his books. That was absolutely clear. But once you manage to put your thinking action into new actions, new procedures. The third step is the toughest, and that is to put this new skill into interaction with other people. First maybe with people you're not familiar with, and then you take it to a level with more and more familiar people. And you will notice that because of the mirror neurons, you will mirror everybody. And that mirroring is so ingrained in our system. It's one of those things that we're conditioned for, which is maybe the hardest to break. And that is usually triggered by social interaction. That's very, very tough. Start easy here. Start maybe with some people you don't know, because then mirroring would be to a minimal level. But otherwise, that's a tougher trait. But that's absolutely possible too. You can do 2-3 things at the same time. It's not impossible to have a movement going on in the head at the same time. On the left hemisphere, you have this chant going on, a hymn, and you do them at the same time. No problem. And that is actually at the kernel of the idea. And I think I come to the end there to showing how the progression goes from T2 to N2 and to T1 and N1. And I hope this was clear enough, and I say thank you very much and ask you a pleasant afternoon. Now, when it's already gotten completely dark here. But do live up, there is a hope.
Thank you.